Good afternoon, class. Today we're going to be talking about Razor Pages. So you should have already read through the introduction and the review of HTML and CSS. If you haven't, go ahead and pause the video, go read through those, make sure that you're back up to speed. Now you've used HTML and CSS and JavaScript back in CS 115, if you throw your mind back that far, and you may have been using it in between. But if you haven't, dig into that review because it is important to understand the basics of what we're doing, because Razor Pages, like all modern websites, is really a full-fledged application that is built on top of those foundations. So it actually uses all of those same technologies. Now before we get to that, let's just talk about how we can create web pages. Back in 115, the web pages you created are what we would call static web pages, which means the file, once you wrote it up, didn't change, and it was just served from a web server exactly as it was. Now, that worked well for the early days of the web, but it wasn't long before we wanted to do more interactive things with web pages, and we started developing dynamic web pages. So these are web pages that what they present is different depending on who's requesting it, when they're requesting it, what information they're asking for. This is basically the modern web. So how do we actually generate a dynamic page? Well, there's a couple things to keep in mind. One is that an HTML file is nothing more than text. So we can manipulate text in other programming languages, and we can actually assemble a web page. So here is an example of a method written in C# called GeneratePage that does exactly that. So we create a string builder, and then we line by line append the text that's going to generate our web page. And here's our dynamic component. Notice in this line we are appending the current date and time as determined by our C# code. So that gets put into this page. So every time we would visit this page, we'd actually get an updated date and time. Now, another thing to keep in mind is the actual HTTP request and the response we get back from our web server, those are also just streams of text. So this is another function, generate response, which would generate the response to a request for this particular page. So here, again, we invoke the generate page to get our HTML, and then we're going to create a string builder, and we're going to append the HTTP 1.1 and status code of 200. We're going to append what type of file we're sending with this header content type. We're going to append how long that file is going to be with the content length. Then we have to append a blank line, because there needs to be a blank line to separate the header section from the body section. And then we're going to send the actual page text, and that's our body section. And then we just send that string. So there's still a little bit of hookup we'd have to do to make this work with C#, because we'd have to be listening to incoming requests on a particular socket, and this would be one possible way we could respond to that. Now, you may think, oh man, that looked really, really ugly. And you're absolutely right. That is one way of writing these kinds of pages, but it is not pretty. In fact, one of the earliest jobs I held in the professional world was maintaining websites that had been written this way. And I can tell you it was not pretty and it was not fun. Thankfully, the web technologies have come a long way since then, and almost all of them use what are called template libraries of one form or another. So in a template library, instead of writing our page this way, we're concatenating strings together in the language that we're programming our backend in. Instead, we write it more like HTML. And then every so often, when we need to run some code, we're using some kind of template identifier to say, hey, run this code at this spot and concatenate its result into this location. So this is what that looks like with PHP, where we have the PHP tag and the echo command to say print that, and that's going to print it in this spot, so right under the hello world. Here's the same thing in Ruby. So here we have the embedded Ruby template. You can see we have this angle bracket % equals, which says I want to concatenate in the result of running this code, which constructs a date time with its current time. And then with C# and Razor Pages, we do the same thing with the @ symbol. The @ symbol prefaces any C# code that we're going to execute. So in here we actually invoke the datetime.now property, which is going to grab the current time and embed it into this page. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to either create a new project or use an existing one. So I'll walk you through the process of creating one, and then we'll come back to this one. So if we're doing it as a new project, we would come in and we would want to find the ASP.NET Core Web Application. We're going to click Next. We're going to give it a name. I'm going to call mine Hello Web. And it's going to actually take us through a couple extra prompts that you don't normally see when we create a project. So the first is it's going to ask us what type of .NET Core web application do we want to do. So the .NET Core, what version we're using, and then what type of application we have. So we have empty, we have an API project, we have a web application using Razor Pages, we have the Model View Controller, which is another framework that Microsoft has developed. It's a little older than Razor Pages, but is especially applicable if this is going to be a large and complex website. We also have some client-side page libraries built in that we can use, like Angular, React, and Redux. We're going to just use Razor Pages with this, a plain old web application at this point. So we go ahead and click Create there. So this is the project, and I want to draw your attention over here to the Solution Explorer. We're going to walk through this project and look at all of its different parts. So you can see, much like many projects, we have a couple of C# files, but we also have some things we haven't seen before. This www root is new, and we have a folder named Pages in here. We're going to walk through these one piece at a time. So we're going to start with program.cs. This is our entry point. So this is where our program will actually begin. And as we'd expect, as an entry point, it's going to have a public static void main method, which is actually what's going to be what gets invoked when we run this program. And inside of that, we're really only doing, well, we're doing three things all kind of one after another. So this first is we run this create host builder method, and we pass in the command line arguments. The result of that, the object we get back from this, we are then going to invoke build on. So we take that object and then we invoke build. This strategy of putting one method after another and just invoking on the result of the last method, this is something called method chaining, and it's actually pretty common in the web world. It's not something you see as often in .NET, but you can see this has definitely been influenced by the web. So this build process, what it's actually doing, well, let's talk about create host builder first. What this actually does is this will create the web host or the web server that we're going to run. This build process actually gets it put together and configured, and this run actually starts it running. So at that point, it will start listening for incoming connections, so incoming requests from the web, and responding to those. And it will continue to do that until we either close this program down or it crashes. Now, this create host builder method, this is actually one that's defined here in this class. This is what we call a factory method because it's actually generating an object based on some configuration information we're passing in. So that configuration information is coming from this startup class here. So this web builder use startup. It's basically saying here's a class that's going to configure and tweak this web server to get it up and running for us. Now this program you'll probably never actually change, but it's good to know what's going on in there. So let's take a look at the startup. So the startup really has two fairly important pieces that we actually might work with over time, and that's configure services and configure. So the configure services is going to basically attach services that we need to actually build and run this application. So in this case, the one service we're adding is Razor Pages. And the configure is actually configuring the web server so it runs the way we expect. And the first thing we're doing here is we're checking to see, are we in development mode? So if we're in development mode, we want, kind of like in debug mode when we're working with desktop applications, we want to give really detailed error messages when things go wrong. We want to really help that developer figure out what's going wrong. And that's what this app.useDeveloperException page is. That means that all of our error pages, so like with the 400s, the 500s, the 302, 303, if there's an error, we're going to get an extremely detailed page which is going to describe what's going to happen and is probably going to have a stack trace in it of the actual code and where the execution went wrong. Now, that's super great if we're a developer, but we never want to put that kind of information out there in the production environment. So we really don't want that if we're running this on the web and people are using this website. If we're letting them see those kinds of crash reports, that really enables bad characters, hackers, to see the underlying structure of our website, and they can use that to actually figure out how to get into our site and do all kinds of damage. So when we're on the web, we want to actually use the exception handler for errors, and that's going to give them just a regular old error page, and we can change what that error page looks like. Some of the other stuff we're going to do, we're going to use HTTPS redirection. HTTPS redirection means that we are going to, if we get an HTTP request, we're going to send back a redirect response saying, no, come back and ask for this page using secure HTTP or HTTPS. The difference between HTTP and secure HTTP is secure HTTP encrypts the communication between the client and the server, so the communication from the web browser to the server. And that's something in this modern world we really want. There's really no web application that should be out there responding to HTTP requests anymore. It should always be secure. Because you're sending information back and forth, and there are a lot of things that a bad player can do with that connection if they have access to that HTTP connection. And the thing to remember is the network traffic, the actual messages we're sending as response and requests, they are traveling across the internet. So they're actually going from switch to switch through different people's hardware and equipment to their destination. And there are lots of ways somebody who happens to have a connection there in the middle can take advantage of that. So we should always be using HTTPS. We also enable this use static files. This means that any static files we have put in a special location, which is actually this www root up here, is just going to be served as is. So this is back to those static web pages where we have a CSS file and it doesn't change, or maybe even an HTML file and it doesn't need to change, it's not dynamic. We can put it there and it will serve it for us and do that fairly promptly. We have to turn on routing, which is how ASP.NET figures out what to do, what response to send in response to the incoming request. And then use authorization allows us to actually use authorization techniques to protect parts of the website unless the user is authorized. And this last bit here, this use endpoints map Razor pages, looks at all the Razor pages we've defined and actually sets up those connections so that when we get a request for that page, our server knows how to respond. So that's the startup, and again, this is probably one you're not going to have to get in and change really at all, and unless you get into some more advanced techniques than we're probably going to cover in this class. But it's good to know how that's actually being configured, because they use the same configuration for lots of different types of web applications. So all of those types of web apps that we saw we could have generated at the beginning, each one of them is going to use a slightly different configuration to set up the parts that they need, and hopefully only the parts that they need. Alright, let's take a look at this www root. So I told you that this is where all of our static files live, and when we request a file, like say we request /css/site CSS, if that's here in this www root, it's just going to be served directly. So this site CSS, this is where we would put all the CSS rules for all the pages on our site, and then we would just include or link that into the actual HTML page that we're serving at that time. The same for the JavaScript. We have one JavaScript file where we put all our JavaScript for our website. There are other ways of doing that. You can split it up over multiple files and only include certain files and certain pages. But for a small web application like we're playing with right now, we usually will just use a single file for each. And then we also have this lib folder. So this is actually something that they did as part of this template. They preloaded a bunch of very commonly used and popular web libraries for us in here. So that includes Bootstrap. Bootstrap is a CSS and JavaScript primarily library for laying out and making applications look pretty, for adding a lot of aesthetic controls and customization that we can play with, as well as a lot of support for responsive design, which means making your web page look different depending on if you're looking on a small screen like a mobile device or a big screen like a 40K or 4K laptop screen. Then we have jQuery, which is a very popular JavaScript library that really just provides some abbreviated and easy to use controls to work with JavaScript. We probably won't be using that really at all in this example, but it's there if you know what JavaScript is and you want to use it. It's actually built in. Also, if these are things you don't need in your site, you can actually delete them out and take them out. Then we get down into our pages. And this is really where the meat of our website is. This is where you're probably going to be doing most of your work. So we have 3 pages defined here: privacy, error, and index. Let's take a look at the privacy one. So this is a page that's written in Razor syntax, and it's going to tell us what our privacy policy for this page is. We're doing a couple things. So the very top of the page we have an @ symbol and page. This is what tells us that this is actually a Razor page, and tells C# that it needs to, as it's compiling this project, treat that as a Razor page and set up the routing for that. And by default, the route that that's going to be tied to is the name of the page, so this would be /privacy. Then we're also defining a model. You'll notice that there is a code behind page, privacy.cshtml.cs. That is the model. And this is very similar to the model view classes that we wrote when we were working with XAML code and the Windows Presentation Foundation. This basically gives us a place to define any kind of structure that we need for our page. And we'll go into this in a little more detail in the next lesson. Then also notice we have some arbitrary code here. So you can also do the @ symbol and just follow it with a curly brace, and then that entire block of code is then interpreted as C#. And here we're taking the view data property, which is a dictionary, and we're setting the title key to equal privacy property. So we're basically, that's a way we can actually set the title of our page and give it a specific value. And then notice we are extracting that same value here in this H1, so this is also going to say privacy policy when we render this page. Index is very similar. We again declare it as a page. We do have a model declared for this one, and we have a div element with a welcome message and an H1 element, and then a paragraph tag that contains a link with some links to some documentation to kind of get us started. The error page is a little interesting. So this is again a page. We have an error model behind it. We're using some Bootstrap classes, text danger. That's going to style this header tag to show, if I remember right, it's going to be an exclamation point next to the error, and it's going to be in red, and it's going to look a little threatening. And then we do the same thing with the H2 tag to say there was an error processing your request. And then we have some information here about turning on or off development mode and why we might want to do that, which we've already talked about. So if you were writing a website, you'd probably replace most or all of this with your own, what you want your web error pages to look like. Up here in this shared folder, let's go ahead and open that up. Actually, before we do that, we're also going to look at these two. So the view imports is a special page, and notice it starts with an underscore. Underscores mean that this is just a snippet that's intended to be included in other pages, we call that a partial, and the putting an underscore in front of it is a convention to show that this is intended to be used as partial. The view imports is actually used for one very special purpose. It is basically included in all of our regular pages before we get into that page stuff. So you'll notice that at the very top we have a using statement. So this is a good place to put all of the using statements for all of the things that we need to have access to on our pages. You could also put those using statements on the page themselves, but if they're going to be used on all your pages, this is just a convenient place to put it. We also have the namespace defined here, so we're saying this is in the namespace helloweb.pages. And we have an add tag helper, which is pulling in these tag helpers. So these are just helpful MVC libraries that we can use to inside of our pages. And we'll see what one of those are here in a moment. Then we also have this view start. And this is just setting properties which are shared amongst all the pages. And the property it's setting is the layout property. That's really the only one we're setting here. And notice that it's setting it to the layout partial, which we can see up here in the shared. So let's go take a look at that. So this is a layout partial. And notice now we have the actual boilerplate for our web page. So we have the doc type, we have that HTML, we have the head and the body. And this method right here, this render body, is actually what is rendering what the results of this piece and the individual pages are being inserted to. So the benefit of using a layout like this is all of this stuff, which is going to be the same on all of our pages, like what style sheet we're pulling in and what JavaScript we're pulling in. All of that is, we only have to write it once, and then we can reuse it on every single page. And in fact, it's automatically used on every single page because we've set that layout here. Now if we wanted to have a second layout, maybe we wanted a couple pages out of our website to use a different layout, we could just define another partial here, and we could say in our index page, if we wanted to use a different layout, we could say layout equals my new layout, or whatever we'd named that. So we actually can swap that at any point for another one if we so need. Any properties we set here are going to override what was set in the view starts. The view starts applied first, and then any properties defined in our page itself is applied. The layout, we've got a lot going on here. You can see we pull in the bootstrap, we pull in that site CSS we looked at before. This meta tag is important if we're intending to do responsive design. We have to have a viewport tag, and we need to set the width to the device width. This is kind of a hacky thing that we have to do, but it's because in the early days of cell phones, when the first cell phones that actually supported web browsers and had a screen came out, they were very, very small screens. And if you looked at a web page at its normal resolution or scaled down to fit on that phone, you would not have been able to see it at all. So by what they actually ended up doing was the mobile browser folks basically told the phone to pretend it was much bigger than it was, so it was a regular computer-sized screen, and it would render it at that resolution, and then it would scale everything down to fit on the screen. So you'd see the whole website in very, very small size on that screen, and then you'd have to zoom in to see individual parts of it. And it was not a very satisfying way to use the web on mobile. Since then, we've come up with the idea of responsive design, where we actually adjust the size of the screen. But in order to do that, we need to actually make sure that the screen, as it's being rendered in the HTML, is at a 1:1 scale. So we have to, this little tag basically says to the device, I want you to render it your actual screen size, not pretend that you're a bigger device. And then here we have that title, and notice there's that view data that we set. So it's pulling out that property that we set, that value we set for the title, and it's going to concatenate it in at this spot. And then we have a little dash hello web that's always going to be attached to the end of that title. When we get into our body, we have this nav bar, which is setting up all of the links to our various pages. And here we have some interesting stuff. This ASP-area and this ASP-page, those are not valid HTML attributes. But we can put any attribute we want inside an HTML tag, and the browser will just ignore ones that it doesn't know. So we're actually using this, that ASP helper that we saw a minute ago is actually using this, and it's saying, oh, that's for me, and it replaces this with a source attribute, which actually maps to the index page. So that's what that helper does, and that's what this is. And you'll see that kind of usage pretty often in HTML frameworks. Angular, for example, takes heavy advantage of its own custom attributes that's added to HTML. So that's a really common strategy. Alright, and whoops, I left some old code in here. I'll just take that out. Okay. Now, one of the things we wanted to do is we wanted to create a new page that would show the current time. So that's basically the same one that I showed you that we wrote out longhand here. We're going to do this as a Razor page. So we're going to come to our pages, and we're going to go ahead and add a new Razor page. And you notice that again we have many options. We have Razor page using Entity Framework, which is a Microsoft library for connecting with databases to make some of that work easier, and then Entity Framework with CRUD. We're not going to use any of that. We're just going to use a straight up Razor page at this point. And we're going to give it a name, and I'm going to call this one time. So we'll go ahead and add that, but before we do that, I'm also going to take off this generate page model class. That's what creates that code behind page, that page model for the page. And for this particular example, we really don't need it. You could leave it on, it won't hurt anything to have it there, but I like to keep things simple when I can, so I'm just going to leave that off, and I'm going to click this add. And we will see how to use that page model a little bit down the road. So that will be coming in our next lesson. Okay, so this has created for us a new page. And notice that we don't have a reference to the page model like we did in the index because we told it not to generate one for us. And we're setting the title to be time, and we have this H1 that automatically put in that we can change to whatever we want. But what we really want to do is we just want to add that line, the time on the server is, and then we'll do that @ symbol for initiating some C#, and we'll go ahead and say date time dot now, so the date time property. And we'll save that, and we can go ahead and run this. Now when we run this, notice that we actually have two possible configurations. We have the IIS Express, and we have this Hello Web. And this is actually a really interesting thing. You can actually define as many configurations as you want, but the reason we have both of these to start with here is because there's actually two main ways that we might be deploying this page. So the first is we might be deploying it on an IIS server, which is an Internet Information System server, or service, I should say, and it's part of the Microsoft Server operating system. So this has been the traditional way to deploy any .NET application for really as long as .NET applications have been around, ASP.NET. IIS started as a static web server, kind of like Apache and a lot of the others as well. And then as we moved into the dynamic web, they added support for rendering dynamic web pages, which was the active server pages. That's what ASP originally stood for, which was using the .NET languages as the programming language. So if you're deploying on an IIS server, the IIS Express is basically a lightweight version that runs in Windows so that you can test your page and make sure it works. So if you're planning on deploying to an IIS instance on a Visual Studio or a Microsoft server, this is what you'd use. Now there is one downside to IIS, as you might imagine. It only runs on Microsoft Server, and Microsoft Server is not cheap to license. That's one of the reasons why Apache is such a big competitor for IIS, because Apache is an open source software and it runs on Linux, and actually it will run on a Mac and Windows as well, though if you're talking about a production server, it's almost always going to be a Linux box running Apache or one of the other competitors out there like Nginx. But the nice thing about a Linux server and Apache means that your operating system and your web server are completely free, whereas you really have to pay some pretty steep licensing fees for Windows Server and IIS. Microsoft, in their push to become more cross-platform, has developed a new web server technology, which, see if I can remember what it's called. Kestrel. It's called Kestrel. So Kestrel is a cross-platform .NET web server, and it's written in .NET Core, which means it can compile and run on anything that supports .NET Core, which includes Linux and Mac as well as Windows. So this is really intended to be a cross-platform server, and you might see it being deployed on a Linux box. You also might be deploying it in Docker instances or some other kind of containerized application framework. It's really intended to be flexible and used in a lot of different ways. Now, we can actually launch either one of these. They're both going to do the same thing. What they're going to do is they're going to start up that server, either IIS Express or the Kestrel server, and then it's going to launch the browser that we've selected here and show the web page that it is serving. And when we run that, it's actually going to be running on localhost. That means it is actually running on this computer, and it's going to be using a non-standard port, so we actually would say localhost in our address bar plus that port number to get to that. Now, at this point, you may have a warning popping up that's asking you to allow Visual Studio to add a security certificate so that your browser can look at this site. Now, this is one of the drawbacks of using HTTPS by default. HTTPS, in order to do that encryption, they also use a security certificate. These would normally be issued by a certifying authority, somebody like CA Trust or someone else who is a trusted server that says this person is who they say they are. This website is actually the website that we assigned the certificate to. You can kind of think of that certificate as like a driver's license. So your state issues you a driver's license that you use to prove your identity, and people can look at that license and trust that you are who you say you are because your picture matches the picture on the license, and they know that the state is a trustworthy source of information. That's exactly how security certificates are intended to work. But when we're running in development mode, we're actually using what's called a self-signed certificate. So our computer has just made up its own security certificate and said, hey, this is mine, this is my identity. Kind of like if somebody just wrote out a driver's license on a piece of paper and brought it into a store when they're trying to buy cigarettes or something like that, you probably wouldn't trust them. And that's exactly what the browsers do when they see an unsigned certificate. They throw up a lot of alerts, a lot of warnings, and in fact, most modern browsers won't even allow you to visit the page unless you drill down into the settings and flip some settings and tell it that you really know what you're doing, because the modern web can be very risky, and a lot of users aren't very cognizant of what those security risks are. So the browsers have really tried to take the responsibility for determining if you should do that action or not out of the hands of the user. So if you don't accept that security certificate, basically just telling your computer that anything issued with the certificate is okay to look at, and your Windows actually plays a little trick on the browser to convince the browser that no, that's actually a valid certificate, it's okay, in order to show that web page. If you don't do that, you will actually get that same warning every time you run your program, and you'll have to drill down and tell it, no, this is okay, this is my website, I know what I'm doing. So once you've accepted that, it should just launch. So right now I launched with the default, which is Edge. You'll notice that it's rendering our page. We see that content that we saw in that index page. We also see the nav bar like we saw in the layout, and I can click on, well, the home just takes me right back to where I am, so that wasn't very helpful. But if I click on the privacy, it's going to take me to the privacy page. But we also notice that our new page that we wrote, the time page, isn't there. Well, we can actually navigate to it directly because we know that it should be at /time. So as long as we use localhost, in my case I'm running port 5001, that's what the :5001 means. That if I hit that, that should take me to the time page, and notice there it tells me the time is now 7:35 p.m. If I navigate again, notice that that time changed by a few seconds. So this is pulling a dynamic web page which is being generated when I send that request. Now, most people aren't going to know that we need to hit that /time and then the address to be able to get to that. So we'll want to go ahead and add that link back in. So if we go look at the layout page, you can see where we're getting these different links in here. This is actually being styled. These classes come out of Bootstrap. So Bootstrap's giving us that nice menu. It has some nice features, and I'll show you a couple more of them here in a minute. But if we drill down, this part here, this UL, which is an unordered list, is actually what's holding the individual pages. And this button right here, or this is actually the brand. So that's what's showing our website name. You can see there it just says Hello Web, which is the name of our application. And this part here, this button, is for that responsive design. So if our screen is too small, it will actually hide these guys here and show a button with the 3 stripes that we can click to expand. So if we were looking at this on a phone, it would actually do that automatically for us. And so we just want to use basically the same structure they're using here. So if you notice inside this unordered list, we have 2 list items. That's what LI stands for. And those are holding links to the various pages. So we need to add another list item and a new anchor tag. And I want to go ahead and use the same class names so that this looks like the other links. And we'll set the ASP area is not really pointing at anything, and then the ASP-page, it needs to match the actual address of our page, which we know is /time. Oop. And then we'll go ahead and add the text inside that anchor tag. And one other thing I need to do, I need to go ahead and put the class nav item on this list item. So it renders like the rest of the menu items. Oop, and I put it in the wrong tag. That's an ending tag. You don't actually put attributes in ending tags, just start tags. There we go. Now if we run this again, we can see that we now have our time link up here in the navigation menu. And if I click on it, it will actually navigate to that dynamic page that we just built. So there we have the time on the server and all those details. And then just to show you, if we were looking at this on a small screen, notice how the menu just collapsed. And now we have these links as a drop-down menu when we click that 3-line bar. And that just shows this project actually gives us a lot of scaffolding, a lot of support for very quickly putting together a web application using Razor Pages. So that's the basics of Razor Pages. We're going to drill down a little deeper in our next couple lessons and learn a lot more about these. But that's enough to get you started.